Donald Trump, diaper Trump, of Donald Trump.
Diaper Trump.
Yeah, diaper Trump. Because he wears diapers, dude. He's a fucking poo-poo pants bitch, okay? He shids himself with a D. He shids himself.
Hello.
Hey, welcome to Left Unread.
My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaging in radical self-education.
That's right. We're two consumer spectators engaged both in imagining the consumption of time and timing the consumption of images as well.
Yes, this go around, we read Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? By Mark Fisher.
Yeah, Mark Fisher. When it comes to the current millennium, few left thinkers have received such mainstream attention as Mark Fisher. He was born in 1968 England. Fisher rose to prominence blogging about the intersections of capitalism and culture, exploring creeping tendrils of the market into music, film, and so much more. His most notable breakthrough came just following the global economic crisis of 2008, when his short but incredible work, Capitalist Realism, was published. One of the founders of Zero Books, still a prominent publisher of leftist thought, his work explores the postmodern malaise and provides a glimmer of hope through the dreary curtain of the so-called end of history.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Mark Fisher, I haven't read any of his other stuff. I've heard him recommended a lot. I am interested in reading his other two books now. This is like a problem with the whole decentralized thing, but like if I was going to want to go read his blog, you know, is it still up? Like, do I just go through the archive or whatever? But another thing that appeals to me about a book, and it's kind of, it might be a core, not a failure, but it is certainly a hurdle that we have to jump on this podcast, is the fact that a book is a contained idea. It's harder to read like articles and pamphlets and things. And like, I can't imagine trying to go through 20 years of blog posts, you know? It seems something that you have to catch like in the moment or like curated later on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that curation was the thing I was thinking of. It's like reading the prison notebooks of Gramsci or something like that. It's like, these are all disparate little things that someone at some point has decided to put together and try to form maybe some form of a cohesive narrative across all of these little pieces that probably do mean significantly less in an asynchronous space. You know what I mean? Like when you're talking about the 2008 financial crisis in 2024, it hits a lot differently than it did in 2008. You know what I mean?
Certainly. I feel like we say this a lot, but there is a certain optimism in this piece that comes from like kind of the environment of the era, so to speak. And it's always crushing to in the after where, you know, it's like there's so much potential here, like the groundswell is here. And then it's like 10 years later, what happens? You know, they're still in this like dreary limbo of nothingness, you know. For the record, listener, we're reading the Zero Books edition from Zero Classics. This one has a foreword by Zoe Fisher and an introduction by Alex Niven, afterward by Tariq Goddard. But his wife talks about how his struggle with depression, you know, and he took his own life in 2017. And both of the introductions make it clear that it would be a disservice to try to directly connect his struggle with depression to the failure of the modern left. But they also say that it's undeniable that it had an effect on him, you know.
Well, one of the things I really want to talk about in this book is his interpretation of the pathologies of mental health crises in the modern day as a response to late-stage capitalism, which bang on take.
So incredible. We're going to talk about it, I'm certain, so I won't put it all on the table now, but Carissa gets angry at me when I say ADHD isn't real, it's made up, you know? But obviously by that I mean it's clearly a side effect of the environment we live in, not some fucking fundamental issue in your brain, right? And I think that something about this text, sorry to cut myself off there, something about this text that I really appreciated is that it feels like a capstone almost, you know? Like so many of the things that we ourselves have read and discussed on this podcast find itself here in a way I think Mark Fisher even gives a lot of words to describe the topics we've kind of been, you know, like we'll see a kernel of it in a previous reading and we'll expand upon it in that moment in the episode. And when I'm reading this now, I'm like, oh shit, it's just like when we were talking about X, Y, or Z, you know? So not only is this a very modern and very contemporary book, but it's also, I mean, it's culminatory, you know, it feels like a synthesis of many things we have already read, believe it or not, you know?
Yeah, I have the exact same reaction. And I really love that we went straight to this from Society of the Spectacle, because as I was reading this, I was like, this is so DeBow.
Yeah. Like right away, very early on, he says consumer spectator, and I was like, like that's, yeah, okay.
He name drops recuperation as well. I have a whole thing that I want to talk about which we talked about in the last episode, but the kind of rudderlessness of living ahistorically, I think he really expands on that. So I agree with you entirely that it feels very much like all of the other reading we've been doing feels like it comes to a head while you're reading this, while ironically, it's also super accessible.
Yes.
And so it almost feels like an introductory text, something that, you know, your anti-capitalist friends that still are uncomfortable with calling themselves a communist or a socialist or something like that would probably read this and agree with everything that he says in it. And I feel like that might be useful to know.
Totally. I mean...
Let's just fucking get into it.
Let's get into it.
Is it worth doing the thing now where we define the thing at the start? Should we define capitalist realism?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Okay. It's how he starts the book anyway.
Yeah, literally on page 2, he gives a pretty good definition of what he means with the term capitalist realism. He says, what I mean by capitalist realism, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it.
Yes. It's a great expansion of postmodernism. I mean, he says that there's almost identical, basically, the postmodern ideal that Frederick Jameson talks about and the capitalist realism that he's talking about. He's just extending it to the modern era. Crazy to say. He's basically saying that, like, the difference between capitalist realism and the postmodernism that Frederick Jameson is talking about is the fact that when those essays were written, there was still an alternative viable in the world, right? Which was Soviet socialism or actually existing socialism. And now the difference is that it is not there. We're aimlessly wandering, we're groping helpless in the dark. What I'm calling capitalist realism can be subsumed under the rubric of postmodernism, as theorized by Jameson. Yet despite Jameson's heroic work of clarification, postmodernism remains a hugely contested term. Its meanings appropriately but unhelpfully unsettled and multiple. More importantly, I would argue that some of the processes which Jameson described and analyzed now have become so aggravated and chronic that they have undergone a change in kind. Are you saying that there's been a quantitative change up to a point that has then led to drastic qualitative change? Interesting. We keep seeing that theme.
Yeah.
Maybe Stalin was right.
I think that's often the case. Anyway, what I was going to say is that, like, I think what I take from this quote that you just read here and what I took from the reason he thinks capitalist realism is a more appropriate term than postmodernism is that I couldn't even give you a definition for postmodernism.
Right.
And I think that that's the problem. I think that's what he's saying here is that it's become so wide a net, so sprawling a concept that it begins to lose its meaning.
Yeah.
And I think capitalist realism speaks very plainly and says very directly what it is. And I agree.
Great job, Mark Fisher. You did it. Yeah, I mean, I really like he attributes it to Zizek, but he says the idea is that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
And ever more poignant, truer than ever, as we catapult towards ecological disaster, which he does mention in here, of course, in what ways did you see maybe an expansion on Dubos's ideas in this book?
Yeah, well, other than all of the times that he's just name-dropping stuff that clearly comes from Dubos.
Yeah.
Like we already mentioned. He calls out recuperation on page 9. He calls folks capitalist spectators.
Yeah, the consumer spectator.
Consumer spectators. There's a lot of stuff like that. But specifically, I would like to jump to page 25 to start.
Okay.
In the last episode, something that came out of the Society of the Spectacle for me was this ahistorical attitude that we take toward modernity.
Yeah.
And I think Fisher does a lot to expand upon that in a way that speaks to me more clearly and puts a firmer concept in my mind of what that means and its ramifications. Starting on page 25, the bottom of the first paragraph, he is, of course, talking about education at this time, but he says, what we in the classroom are now facing is a generation born into that ahistorical, anti-mnemonic blip culture, a generation, that is to say, for whom time has always come ready cut into digital micro slices.
Yeah.
We're made to consume everything in tiny little blips, 140 characters or whatever the fuck it once was on Twitter. I don't know what it is now.
Well, it depends if you pay $8 or not.
Okay, so 140 characters on Twitter. 60-second reels or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, we're fed everything in such tiny little quantities, which means that we get fed so much of it that all of it is inherently meaningless.
Right.
And we are then conceptualizing ourselves, our own sense of identity, our own sense of personhood, as being just another one of those many 140-character explanations or 60-second videos. And it just leaves us up a creek without a paddle. It leaves us in a completely rudderless situation. We don't know where we came from, and so there's absolutely no way for us to know where we're going. He expands on this quite a lot. I have a few others.
Tons.
Just to jump around a little. Let's go to 32.
Oh, yeah.
He's talking about the corrosion of character, the personal consequences of work in the new capitalism by Macaulay and Sennett, which is a landmark study of the effective changes that the post-Fordist reorganization of work has brought about. The slogan, which sums up the new conditions, is no long term, and that workers are made to periodically reskill as they move from institution to institution, with a premium being put on flexibility.
Yeah.
This is just more of the subtle ways that this kind of ahistorical, completely isolated identity that capitalism, late-stage capitalism, is forcing us into.
Even a couple lines above, their arrangement is temporary, pragmatic, and lateral. They know that they are interchangeable machine parts. There are no guarantees, that nothing lasts.
Yes.
Yeah. Fisher does a lot to bring in like pop culture references, movies and music and things like that. And I like how he juxtaposes the two movies here between Goodfellas and Michael Mann's Heat.
Yeah.
Where he's saying that Goodfellas is very familial, very traditional. It's rooted in history. That's the whole idea. Even in The Godfather, right? He says Corleone is named after a town in Italy.
Yep.
Whereas in Heat, there's like that sudden shift. It's all this concrete landscape. There's no permanence, only like pure operators, you know?
You got to be ready to walk away.
Yeah, attached to nothing. Yeah, it's even, you know, the way that the family structure is both like a means of control for capitalism, but it also is antithetical to what capitalism requires. And he says the same thing when he's talking about Heat. He's saying that the operators can't, you know, it's like if you have to take off at a moment's notice, how can you fucking raise a family, you know?
Yeah.
If capitalism requires this like insane flexibility, no long-term planning, how are we supposed to long-term plan for a family, you know? I mean, that's the struggle that Chris and I are going through right now. It's because we do ultimately want to have kids. But the question is, like, how can I get all the pieces into place so that we can adequately do that? And it's not compatible with capitalism, right? Like, I'm searching for this, like, new job that's going to provide that long-term planning, but it's just not in the cards, you know?
Yeah. If I can throw one last quote to kind of put a bow on this idea.
Yeah, I have one as well. On page 59, he talks about this even in the news cycle. Quote, on the one hand, this is a culture that privileges only the present and the immediate. The extirpation of the long-term extends backwards as well as forwards in time. For example, media stories monopolize attention for a week or so and then are instantly forgotten. You remember when 2 people tried to shoot Donald Trump in the face?
Yeah.
That was a part of the news for a minute, wasn't it? Anyway, what was your last quote?
It's on 34.
Okay.
And I specifically wrote, the spectacle leaves us rudderless right next to this because I think it so perfectly encapsulates what Debout was evoking in the Society of the Spectacle. To function effectively as a component of just-in-time production, you must develop a capacity to respond to unforeseen events. You must learn to live in conditions of total instability or precarity, as the ugly neologism has it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you were saying about raising kids. It's like you're put in this position where it's like, yeah, go forth and do all of this, but also do it while the ground under you is shaking and unstable.
I'd like to expand this out to kind of a larger topic here, because I'm thinking about what he says about the Leninist model, how the kind of flexibility is required, but at the same time, the Leninist model literally requires inflexibility. I'm just looking even further down on the page here, right, where he talks about the shift from a Fordist model to a post-Fordist model, right? He says, both Marazzi and Sennett point out that the disintegration of stable working patterns was in part driven by the desires of the workers. It was they who, quite rightly, did not wish to work in the same factory for 40 years. In many ways, the left has never recovered from being wrong-footed by capital's mobilization and metabolization of the desire for emancipation from the Fordist routine. Antagonism is now not located externally in the face-off between class blocks, but internally in the psychology of the worker, who as a worker is interested in old-style class conflict, but as someone with a pension fund is also interested in maximizing the yield from his or her investments. He says something here that I was interested by, because it reminds me of our struggle with the mass line. with the party, right? What do you do with people that are dissenting? On page 28, flexibility, nomadism, and spontaneity are the very hallmarks of management in a post-Fordist control society. But the problem is that any opposition to flexibility and decentralization risks being self-defeating, since calls for inflexibility and centralization are, to say the least, not likely to be very galvanizing. It's like this push and pull. It's this push and pull between the need for the individual and the need for the collective.
He's saying that disintegration of stability for the worker has been transplanted from the capitalists putting it on the worker to now being in the psychology of the worker. And part of that comes from this idea that we believe as workers, this is utopian in my opinion, but we believe as workers in this old style class conflict, but we also have a pension fund, like that sort of thing. This was kind of what I was getting at when I said earlier that like we have to learn to be something other than anti-capitalist. And I think it also feeds into the way that we digest quote unquote protest media. Like he uses Children of Men as an example for a good bit of the beginning of the book, which is a dystopian film, but it's not openly dystopian, and that's a big part of his analysis of it. Is that it's like dystopian in the background while this other story takes place.
Yeah, let's go ahead and pivot onto that. What was so interesting about his Children of Men discussion is the idea that he says that it's the suspicion that the end has already come.
Yeah.
Right? It's the thought that it could well be the case that the future harbors only reiteration and repermutation. It's that fucking Faulkner quote, The past isn't even dead. It's not even past, right? The past is being changed. Actually right here on page 3, the new defines itself in response to what is already established. At the same time, the established has to reconfigure itself in response to the new. Eliot's claim, T.S. Eliot that is, was that the exhaustion of the future does not even leave us with the past. Tradition counts for nothing when it is no longer contested and modified. The culture merely preserved is no culture at all. It's a destruction of history, History has even been reconfigured so much so that I'm thinking now even about our defense of Stalin, even if Stalin truly was a monster, which debatable, that history has been changed because of our position in current day capitalism. Whether Stalin was a monster or not, people are looking at him as a figure against capitalism. And that is what is like, I'm just thinking now about what you were saying. It's like we need to truly be anti-capitalist. It's not that we're simply taking over the structure, but we're subordinating it to our will. It concerns me that China still has capital in it, but I'm interested in the subordination part, An
attitude like that feels inherently reformist.
It is reformist.
Yeah.
Right? It is revisionist.
So, but it's never going to happen.
What do you mean?
You'll never find revolution through reform.
Yeah.
Like, you're never going to piecemeal your way to a revolution. Maybe the way to do this is to... Okay, let's go to page 30. Something about it really spoke to me, this final paragraph. He says, what must be discovered is a way out of the motivation-demotivation binary, so that disidentification from the control program registers as something other than dejected apathy. And he goes on to explain. But the dejected apathy really struck me. And I said the rejection of expectations is more than dejected apathy. It's incumbent upon us to build a new narrative, form a new narrative around the kind of purgatorial feeling of trying to exist in a state that we reject. Like, not to memeify everything we're talking about, but the yet you exist in capitalism kind of bullshit. But this is back to the pension fund thing. Like, there is a contradiction with trying to exist in a world that you are inherently against. And so to call yourself anti-capitalist, to call oneself anti-capitalist is fine and dandy, right? But like, we are still participating in capitalism, participating in capital.
Yeah.
Largely because like, what the fuck else are we going to do? Like, we have no organizational stability around us to provide a reasonable alternative. So here we are just saying like, yeah, that shit sucks, and still trying to find a way to make do. And this is where like ethical consumption comes in and shit like that. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Sure.
I do very much believe that. That doesn't mean you should do nothing and it's a hand wave, you know. But like, for people that are in that position, that's a very confusing position to be in. And what the fuck are we doing? Like, we resist organization, we organize poorly, and that's all a tool of capitalist realist oppression. This perpetuation of isolationism, that's not a solution, Like, a lot of people that are not particularly class conscious, but are anti-capitalist to some degree, have wild dreams of, like, homesteading, essentially.
Right.
It's like, I just want to buy a fucking 30 acres and go live with my family alone.
The ultimate message is leave me alone, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That does nothing.
Right.
That, I would argue that's not even anti-capitalist, but at the very least, it's not doing anything to actually perpetuate anti-capitalism. And it's like we're in this weird limbo.
Yeah.
We have to come up with something better. Like, I'm just stating the thesis of the book.
No, he talks about the left's vice is the fact that they can't stop retreading the same old fucking ground.
Yeah.
Which made me cackle because here we are again, retreading the same old ground.
Let me try to put some of these pieces together because this is all just a big wash in my mind. Usually you're the one that does a good job of gluing everything together. I can't be the one because I think that this is related to what I was calling protest media. I think this is related to consumption and complacency, but I have pieces all over the book that I'm trying to put together for this.
That's the same here.
Okay, let's go to page 12 for a second.
All right.
And he's talking about Wall-E is the film that he's using here, but near the bottom of the page, he says, subjugation no longer takes the form of a subordination to an extrinsic spectacle, but rather invites us to interact and participate. And when he's talking about Wall-E, a little further down, he says, the film performs our anti-capitalism for us.
Yes.
Allowing us to continue to consume with impunity.
Right. What Robert Fowler calls inner passivity.
Yes. And I think that there's something really poignant in that. I think the best show on television right now is a show called Severance, which is pretty anti-capitalist in its messaging, certainly anti-corporation in its messaging. There's only one season out, but the second season starts in January. I'm very excited. But anyway, the point is, we can't look to media like that to be the messages that perform or speak to anti-capitalism for us because it's a fucking product. The show itself is a commodity.
Yeah.
That show is on Apple TV.
Okay.
Like, there's something inherently contradictory in that.
Yeah.
And it placates us. It gives us some feeling inside that it's like, I agree with the messages of this show, but it does nothing to change the nature of our lives.
What I'm starting to come to here is, he says it a couple times in the book. I'm looking at the next page. It is impossible to conceive of fascism or Stalinism without propaganda, but capitalism can proceed perfectly well, in some ways better, without anyone having to make a case for it, right? Capitalism is considered natural, and so much so that it doesn't even have to be considered good. It just has to be considered empirical. What I'm just thinking about now is that the consumption of those things is propaganda, right? Like,
yes.
Yeah, it's not actual substance. It's contemplative, essentially, you know?
Yeah, he says on 13, so long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange.
Yeah, I love actually even where he says, a moral critique of capitalism emphasizing the ways in which it leads to suffering only reinforces capitalist realism. Poverty, famine, and war can be presented as an inevitable part of reality, while the hopes that these forms of suffering could be eliminated easily painted as naive utopianism. Even before that, earlier in the book, where he's quoting Baidu on page 5, to justify their conservatism, the partisans of the established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful, so instead they have to decide that all the rest is horrible, right? Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats with machetes like they do in Rwanda. All I'm thinking of right now is the fact that the emancipation can't be something consumable. He says it in so many different ways. Even when he's talking about Bono and the Red campaign, it's like you just have to buy the right products and that will solve the problems.
Yeah.
We can't create a product for people to buy or consume. You know, we have to create like literally what it seems to be a natural order.
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's what I mean when that's puts more clearly and succinctly what I was trying to get at about how we have to be more than anti-capitalist. We have to create a new narrative. You can't, what did you say? You can't purchase your emancipation.
Yeah, right.
Capitalism can't be a tool for selling someone their way out of capitalism.
Yeah, because anti-capitalism is just another flavor of capitalism, much in the same way where he says the alternative is just another style of the mainstream.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And to come back to like shows like Severance or The Boys is one that gets brought up a lot in these sorts of conversations.
Yeah.
It's like, this is what's in the Overton window. This is the allowable protest of the status quo.
Yeah.
That is still a part of the status quo to make you feel as though you are somehow separate from the status quo. But it's just another part of the status quo being sold to you as protest or being sold to you as resistance. # resist. Buy your fucking pussy hat.
I'm just thinking about the end of the book again. He says that effective anti-capitalism must rival capitalism. It must not react to it.
Yeah.
That's the main thing. The question is, how? How? What structures could we put into place that would rival capitalism? Even on page 79, he says, it is an open question as to whether the old structures can nurture this subjectivity. I'm feeling like horribly disillusioned right now. Just like, wow, we're fucked.
Again, you're doing a better job of like getting to the kernel of what I was trying to communicate. Part of the point is that it's so fucking difficult to conceptualize something different.
Yeah.
That it's such an oppressive and immersive system that it's hard to see out of. It's like the Blob.
Yeah.
It just sucks you in and then you can't see out. You got nothing. You're suffocated by it. And so it is really difficult to even imagine the alternative. And that is really tough. The tools have to exist. The alternative has to exist. It's just really fucking hard to see it from the inside.
The thing is, like, this book is full of ideas. I think maybe what would be better is to talk about the actual concrete things which he says pose a threat to capitalism, right? If we're trying to envision an alternative to capitalism, he says a moral critique won't do, right? It has to be substantive. It has to be it has to depose capitalism as being a natural order. He says, capitalist realism can only be threatened if it's shown to be in some way inconsistent or untenable. And he does give some examples, right? The big three here. Number one is the green argument, which he says has already gotten undercut a little bit, right? But I'm sure that if you've listened to us thus far, you're aware of how we feel about the oncoming ecological disaster. The other two, he says, are the mental health crisis and also bureaucracy, right? So it might be, we might have some...
Look at those three things.
We might have some easier footing if we start with those three. Because right now I feel like we're trying to grab at a billion different topics.
Yeah.
Not without reason. I mean, that's the key here.
Maybe we were a little too zoomed out.
I think that is the case. Yeah. We might be able to focus in a little better if we focus in on one thing.
Okay. There is some, what do they call it? There's a phrase for it that he doesn't use. It's called green masking or
greenwashing.
Greenwashing. Yes. Thank you. Because he mentions that on 18. He says, when he is first talking about environmental catastrophe, he says that climate change and the threat of resource depletion are not being repressed so much as incorporated into advertising and marketing. A presupposition that resources are infinite, that the earth itself is merely a husk, which capital can, at a certain point, slough off like a used skin, and that any problems can be solved by the market. Capitalism is in fact primed to destroy the entire human environment. So there's a contradiction there where we know that you can't have infinite growth on a finite system, and that capitalism and imperialism, colonialism as an extension of capitalism is exacerbating that resource depletion.
Right.
We know that to be true, so we get sold products that are renewable, biodegradable, things that are like supposedly green products. He's saying that it just becomes a way to advertise and market more shit.
Yeah, the problem is, I think it's very clear that the ecological angle is not sufficient to demystify people.
Well, we've had 15 years or so since this book was written, and I don't feel like we've made much more headway than he made in this argument.
No, we're certainly not. But that's the thing, is like, that's so striking to me, because if like literal disaster we can't even imagine the end of the world. That's the thing. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. We can't even imagine the end of the world. We're still sitting here in our bubble going, okay.
We can't reckon with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Certainly I can imagine it. But that's, it feels like, did you watch Don't Look Up?
No. I'm not a big fan of Adam McKay.
I don't know if it was worthwhile, other than like it was funny, but that's just how it feels. Like there's literally a fucking meteor in the sky and everyone's like, I can't fucking see it.
Yeah. I'll worry about that tomorrow.
Yeah. So that's the problem. It's like, I understand why he brings up these 3 points to show why capitalism is not satisfactory, but I don't understand how those points are going to not be subsumed. You know what I mean? Like I don't understand how those aren't going to be incorporated any more so than they already are. Right? Clearly the ecological disaster will just be hand waved away. Bureaucracy is just a natural part of capitalism. Nobody thinks of it as a failure of capitalism. They just think of it as a side effect, a symptom.
Yeah, he uses the call center analogy, I think, very well.
Yeah, absolutely.
To explain everyone's frustration with bureaucracy, but it's like the alternative is not, but it's like, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah, and in fact, I actually really love that he says, does anyone really think that this would be better if we just replace them with better bureaucrats?
Yeah.
Obviously, no one thinks that's the case. So bureaucracy, I don't understand how those things aren't going to be just incorporated also. You know what I mean?
To a degree, all of these things have been. Well, I mean, the call centers are a good example and are just kind of like acceptance that that's the way that it has to be. With greenwashing, with the climate catastrophe, and the one that resonated most strongly with me was the argument around mental health. Perhaps that's because I suffer from so many of the things that he describes in this book, but that too is a thing that has been, to a degree, just kind of capitalized or monetized at least. They'll sell you plenty of drugs.
I mean, even beyond that, I think that, this is a broader discussion past this book, but I think that, like, the individualization of mental health is almost like a fucking badge is incredibly fucked up. And it's a kind of reification that there's been a big trend of self-diagnosis, armchair diagnosis, internet diagnosis for mental health recently in like the last 10 years, in the era of social media. And I think what we're seeing is the adaptation of capitalism to reckon with the fact that those things are entering the popular consciousness. It's not so much that these things are considered failures of the system or even necessarily failures of the individual, but they're now simply seen as a feature, right? It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's like, yeah, I have autism, I have ADHD, I have DID, whatever. Like, I think that there's a very specific kind of weaponization of those things that happens on the internet today that is reflective of the way that capitalism is dealing with the contradiction. That it's not the perfect system. It clearly is causing issues, especially in the mental health department. And I think that the way that it is individualizing and atomizing those diseases, even beyond the chemical thing going on in your brain, is indicative of capitalism's power to subsume. You know what I mean? What I was thinking of specifically in the internet is when he talks later about Adam Curtis. Have you ever watched any Adam Curtis documentaries?
Mm-mm.
I really, really fucking recommend. Trauma Zone is like one of my favorites of all time.
Oh, I've heard of that, yeah.
I've told you about Trauma Zone certainly before. Incredible. He also has a really good one, Hypernormalization, which is like about the rise of Donald Trump. Diaper Trump.
Yeah,
Diaper Trump. Because he wears diapers, dude. He's a fucking poo-poo pants bitch, okay? He shids himself with a D. He shids himself. On page 75, Curtis attacks the internet because, in his view, it facilitates communities of solipsists, interpassive networks of like minds who can form rather than challenge each other's assumptions and prejudices, right? The internet has, it's created these echo chambers that are so powerful, I think, that it can even deal with something as strong as that mental health contradiction. That's ultimately what I was trying to say there. Fucking capital's got hands, dude. That's the problem. Capital is strong as fuck. In every aspect, even in our anti-capitalist history, capital is now there. Thinking about China again, they had to incorporate capital because it's unbeatable.
Your discussion about mental health and the internet got me thinking about it in a kind of a different way.
Okay.
I'm going to struggle with putting it together, of course, but the kind of self-diagnosis thing that has become a larger trend, I do it. I definitely do it. I mean, I have been medicated for things, certainly, but I feel more assured that I am farther along on the autism spectrum than anyone has ever told me I am.
Dude.
Here was my reaction initially to what you were saying, which was that, this kind of pattern of self-diagnosis that is largely bulwarked by the internet. I think that this is a rabbit hole that a lot of liberals fall down with identity politics in general, which is that we become aware of forms of oppression that capitalism are imposing upon us, and we rightly recognize those things, and we rightly want to fight against those things, right? But what that ultimately does, for the most part, is serve as a tool of division among the people, among the masses, to create more division, to make it harder and harder for organization and mobilization to occur. And I think that the kind of online spaces of mental health awareness and our interactions with mental health, and to a large degree, I would lump in all forms of disability with this, all forms of ableist attitudes, create just another space for us to dissent against one another, another space for us to disagree with one another and create division that makes us more and more divided. And so to a large degree, I think like capital's response to mental health has been capitalize it by monetizing drugs and continue to not provide health care to folks so we can make as much money as possible off of people reasonably responding to the contradictions that we have created, but also allow those spaces to get overcome with infighting around the things that we have, the isms that we have created and put in those communities. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's just another one of those.
Yeah, another divisionary tactic.
Yeah.
You know?
That's the spectacle, I guess, more than anything. But
let me get the disabled union is the only thing I could think of, you know? Rather than having all these different bubbles about different mental healths, it should be like one mental health group against capitalism.
Well, and something else you said is kind of reframing my thinking around it and is pulling climate change into it a little bit differently as well, because he does say pretty deep in the book, this is on 66.
Okay.
He's talking about recycling.
Yeah, a great bit about who is the subject supposed to recycle.
Yeah.
You know, who is responsible for climate change.
Yeah. By making recycling the responsibility of everyone, structure contracts out its responsibility to consumers by itself receding into invisibility. He calls that responsibilization.
Yeah.
That's weird to say, responsibilization. And goes on, lastly, to say, instead of saying that everyone, i.e. everyone, is responsible for climate change, we all have to do our bit. It would be better to say that no one is, and that's the very problem.
Right.
So much like you had said something kind of similar to this before, but it takes something that is a systemic failure, or at least a cultural failure, and turns it into an individual failure.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the same thing that happens with mental health in the way that it is spoken about. You are disabled.
Right.
You, sufferer of depression, sufferer of anxiety, you autistic person, you person with ADHD, you OCD, like you have some sort of mental incapacity that is a personal failing that we can solve through medication, that you cannot have provided to you by the state. So buy insurance so you can buy overpriced medication from Big Pharma so you can solve this personal failing of yours, or at least manage this personal failing so it's less of a problem for me, rather than recognizing the kind of cultural form that is causing all of this to begin with, right? And I don't know, that makes me feel like maybe there is something there that if it can be, even though it is very clearly being weaponized against working people, against us as individuals, it is maybe an inroad to get people to recognize that oppression in the way systems like this work. Because he even uses an analogy at some point in the book where he's talking about losing weight. Yeah,
that's actually a really good place to pick up here. Yes, to tell people how to lose weight or how to decorate their house is acceptable, but to call for any kind of cultural improvement is to be oppressive or elitist.
Yeah, like, because one denotes an individual failing, one denotes a cultural failing or a systemic failing. And so one is acceptable. It's okay to call out individuals, but it's not okay to call out the system.
Yes. In the same way, though, there's an interesting parallel where he's talking about Stalinism. He's talking about fucking on page 69. For this reason, it's a mistake to rush to impose individual ethical responsibility that the corporate structure deflects. This is the temptation of the ethical, which has argued the capitalist system is using in order to protect itself in the wake of the credit crisis. The blame will be put on supposedly pathological individuals who's abusing the system rather than on the system itself. The evasion is actually a two-step procedure, since the system will often be evoked, either implicitly or openly, precisely at the point when there is the possibility of individuals who belong to corporate structures being punished. At this point, suddenly, the cause of the abuse are so systemic, so diffuse, that no individual can be held responsible.
Yeah.
Right? They're doing both things, you know? The problem is completely atomized, completely individualized. But then if you try to change the individual, the only solution is to say, the system is so fucked that we can't possibly attribute this to any single person.
Yeah.
It's playing both sides in that sense.
Yeah.
I came really prepared today, and I feel like a fucking moron.
I feel like I'm not getting any of the things out that I really wanted to get out either, but I do want to say a couple more things about mental health.
Yeah, by all means.
Let me read a couple of quotes about mental health here. Well, first of all, on 36, he says, it is selfish, i.e. neoliberalized, capitalist policies and culture that are to blame for things like depression. And he goes on 37 to say, it goes without saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated.
Yes.
But this says nothing about their causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. So this suggestion that he's making that the mental health crises are a symptom of late-stage capitalist contradiction is not negating the fact that there is a physical part of mental health. But acknowledging that is not he's not like belittling folks. Okay, to say to someone that has ADHD, like, that's all made up.
Right.
Probably feels very demeaning and belittling to a person that suffers from ADHD.
Right.
Or lives with ADHD to suggest that. Like, that's all made up.
Yeah.
He's not saying that. He's saying that, like, there is a component that is neurological.
Yeah.
That doesn't answer the cause question, and the cause question is capitalism.
Yeah.
It can be both.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a dismissal of everyone that suffers from whatever mental health disability they suffer from.
Yeah.
It's not a dismissal, but it is an acknowledgement that it's fucked.
So here's the thing, though. This is what I'm thinking about. First off, there's a new medical ad on TV it's like a hair regrowth supplement, and the ad is so telling because it's like, has life got you stressed and this has made you lose your hair? And it's like all of these people that are like, my kid is really driving me crazy, or I had a big project at work, and it's like, there's many steps in this chain and you're only pointing at the first and the last one. Like, the stress is making you lose your hair. What's causing the stress? Oh, my children, right? Mm-hmm. Why are you stressed with your children? Well, it's because I don't have any fucking time to be with them, right? Or, my work is now, it's like all of this still boils down to capitalism. It's just like, where's the disconnect in the line?
Yeah.
Much in the same way, though, I'm going back to what we were saying about how our ideology can't be something consumable, to what extent is that hamstringing us is kind of my question, because I was following a chain of thoughts here. If the root problem is capitalism, then it goes back to class consciousness. How do you get people to be conscious of the fact that the class conflict is going to be what is liberatory to them? And then I was saying, okay, well, then you have to educate them, right? You have to tell them, they have to see at least, not necessarily that you tell them, but they have to be convinced. And the question is, how do you do that convincing without the creation of something that's consumption, right? Without the creation of propaganda. But he even mentions that in here, how like even Das Kapital has a monetary value, in what ways can we affect this system without also reinforcing it? I don't know what those structures are.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I don't mean to oversimplify it, but my gut feeling in response to that is you just have to make sure that the scales are tipped.
Yeah.
You're never going to disseminate education in a way that isn't to some degree being capitalized.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we bought these books. You could buy it used and feel a little better about that maybe, but someone still bought it and that money still went to someone that wasn't the author. You know what I mean? Like, so there's always going to be some sort of monetary gain there. We're spreading this podcast on a platform. I pay to have it hosted. So then it goes on to streaming services that you pay to be a subscriber to. It's like there's always going to be some element of that right now. You just got to make sure that the scales are tipped.
So yeah, that's the thing though, is that it's that thing about flexibility again, where you have to be disciplined and inflexible enough to fight against those forces, but still flexible enough to get a popular base. Where do you find that line? It's not a question we'll be able to answer. It's just that's the big question in my mind from this book.
That's fair. That's a fair question. It's bringing to mind all of the stuff about pure communists and stuff like that. Maybe to close the thing about mental health.
Okay.
Because the thing that really spoke to me, and funnily enough, while we were in the middle of this, I happened upon a TikTok where a communist creator on TikTok was saying something very similar about mental health and about depression and anxiety specifically under capitalism as like being a reasonable response to the conditions that we're forced to live under, yet it's made to seem like an individual failing. And I think that he says that quite well on page 19. He says, instead of treating it as incumbent on individuals to resolve their own psychological distress, instead, that is, of accepting the vast privatization of stress that has taken place over the last 30 years, we need to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill. And I think that that's very appropriate. How is it possibly a personal failing if so many fucking people are dealing with it? It can't be a personal failing if this many people are dealing with it.
The thing is that I'm just thinking about all my fucking boomer uncles and aunts, man. Why not? Why not? Why couldn't it be a personal failing? You know, I'm just thinking about like, dude, when I was teaching, like I had this discussion with my uncle, and they were like, it's just these lazy parents. It's just, you know, it's like all of these like very real issues, but it's like you're missing the underlying problem between all of these. But I don't understand what's going to shake that for them.
Like what's going to make them see the light?
Yeah. What's going to make them think that these people aren't just lazy, right? That, you know, like I used to feel that way. I used to really hate homeless people, man. And it's because I was like, you know, I was annoyed by them, right? I didn't like being heckled on the street or whatever. I lived in Atlanta, you know, I dealt with homeless people every fucking day. And I couldn't stand it, you know? And I'm just trying to think of how my view shifted from like, ugh, I can't stand these, you know, homeless people to like, oh man, these people are being chewed up by the system. And it was not for, I mean, there wasn't anything that was done. It just happened by, I don't know, me reading these books and shit. But I don't know, man. This is making me feel like a doomer right now. I'm just feeling like a fucking, like, listless. Like, I can't do anything about this.
Welcome to the club. It's humorless here. But, yeah, I don't know. To that point, this is not about the book per se, but when wrestling with questions like that, I've come, and it's a large part of what disillusioned me with education in general. And I was talking to our former principal about this while basically the last 2 years of my career as a teacher, because I was increasingly digging myself or unable to dig myself out of this giant hole in my ideological beliefs around education.
Right. Irreconcilable differences.
Yeah, I just don't think education is a liberatory project in the way that I did when I started. And it's not that education itself is not liberatory, because that's the only way to liberate yourself is through education. The realization that I came to is that you can never be liberated. You have to be a liberator. You have to be the one. And in this context, like talking about homelessness as an example, how do you shift someone's attitude from like fucking lazy bum, get a job, to recognizing someone that's houseless as like a symptom of a larger systemic problem? That comes from your own education, and other people trying to tell that to you isn't the thing that's going to flip the switch in your brain.
Yeah.
It wasn't for me.
I'm thinking about that question. What radicalized you? You know, you have to be radicalized, right? Something has to disconnect you from the everyday.
Yeah.
You know, when I talk to my idiot Republican friends about politics and they always get upset, they're like, not everything has to be political. It's because they're comfortable. You know, they don't have to reckon with any issues in politics because they're white men. You know, there's nothing that is actually forcing them to change. And I don't want to sound like an accelerationist, but like, what is going to, you know, like, is it going to require a catastrophe, you know?
Something I've been wrestling with a little bit, or thinking about a lot lately. I wouldn't say I'm wrestling with it. I feel very assured in my position, but something I've been thinking about a lot lately is this knee-jerk reaction that people have when you take a position in defense of the oppressed.
Yeah.
The knee-jerk reaction often is, in what way are you marginalized by that oppression? Like, for example, like if you call out someone's homophobia, and they're like, are you gay? It's like, you don't have to be gay to be against homophobic attitudes. You don't have to be trans to be in support of trans rights. You know what I mean? Like, and something that always stuck in my side in the worst way, especially when I was a little bit more involved in like radical feminist organizations, was this idea, this narrative around specifically reproductive health, that it's like, I've got daughters, I have a sister, I have a wife. Bitch, I don't need any of those things to be in support of bodily autonomy. I really don't like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's really dumb. And I'm thinking about this because, like, your point, like, those dudes, they're just perfectly comfortable white men. They never have to face the reality of that, of the system chewing other people up because they're the last in line to be chewed.
Yeah.
There's something really fucked about that. I, too, don't know what's going to get through to those folks other than some sort of accelerationist line about it finally affecting them.
Yeah. So it's the thing, though. It's that push and pull between like changing yourself and being changed, though, because like homophobia is a great example. There's been a resurgence of the F slur in my fucking, not my Discord, but in the Discord I game in with people. And I'm just like, hey, like, you can't fucking say that, you know? And they're like, well, you know, what, are you gay? And the answer is like, yeah, like, yeah, so
Yeah.
now what, bitch? Like, what now, And like, that has had some effect because they have to actually reckon with the fact that it's like a real issue. There is something that can change those people. There is something, and I think ultimately it does come from within, but I think the impetus is going to have to come from without. For me, right, going back to my example, a big part of my radicalization was that the big picture of my future came into play. It became clear that economics was bullshit, right? I was not going to get a job. I was not going to go and live like the American white man dream, get a degree, go work in an office, retire in 40 years. And part of that was incredibly radicalizing to me, was just to understand that, like, the pathway, like, it was such a guarantee, the pathway. Go to college, get a job, that as soon as it was like, this clearly is not going to happen, that was shattering to me, and I think that was part of the reason I was so open to a more radical politic at the time, so I just don't know what it's going to take.
This is almost like a throwback to the episode 1 when we were kind of talking about how we got here.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you need to be, I find it morally repugnant that you have to be affected by something to recognize it as wrong. So I don't agree. I don't like that. I don't like that as a position, and like there has to be some other way, because that's not been my experience.
Yeah.
My personal answer to the question, what radicalized you, is really hard to answer, because I did not have a radicalization that came in the form of a moment. Like, a friend of mine got beat up by a cop.
Yeah.
That was a very radicalizing moment for this person. I can see how a moment like that radicalizes someone. Being victimized by another human being in whatever capacity that, whatever form that takes, that's clearly a radicalizing moment. This isn't like coming from some moral superiority or something like that, but like from a very young age, I've been like, it's fucked up to fuck with other people.
Yeah.
So like I've gradually become more educated.
Sure.
I understand better the systems that create that oppression. I understand better how I have in the past and continue to unwillingly participate in the oppression of others and things like that. You know what I mean? But like, I didn't have a radicalizing moment. So it's like, there has to be a way to get to people that isn't like, be affected by it.
Well, the thing is, I think that it is and it isn't. One, I think that a moment is a little bit of a disservice, because radicalization is a long process, Yeah, you didn't have a specific moment, but the events around your life, right, the stimuli that you were reacting to led you to be radical,
Yeah, I think that that's fair, and I don't mean to diminish that. But
no, I'm not.
I'm a millennial. I've lived through many once-in-a-lifetime crises.
Right. But on top of that, I think that it's about the interpretation, right? It's about what the environment around you preconfigures you to think. You and I might have been raised in a place where our reaction would be, this is injustice, this needs to be changed, right? But when my fucking idiot buddy sees a homeless person, he's like, that's an individual failing, right? It's not even a consideration that it could be systemic in his mind.
Yeah.
And so I think that the education doesn't come from affecting a person, like radicalizing a person, but it's about opening their perspective to understand that the reason behind these things should be radicalizing. It's that, or it's like, I think the white man is a great example. Like, why is the male loneliness epidemic become so in play? And it's because the white man has been in less of a position of power than ever before. The actual reaction that you or I might say is, fucking smash the fash, destroy the patriarchy, uproot capital at its fucking very core. But to them, it's the immigrants. Mm-hmm. To them, it's
they need
like,
a scapegoat.
Yeah, I'm being replaced, and it's like, to them, it's right. I'm sure there are some people that are like, oh, like ironic fascists or whatever, but like, those people believe those things,
Literal Nazis marched through Columbus.
Yeah, like the other day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fucking crazy.
It's the cavalcade of quotes.
Yes, sir. Oh, I love this one on 63. Sorry to start us off so late, but on 63, I love this quote. Scapegoating an impotent government, running around to clean up the messes made by its business friends, arises from bad faith, from a continuing hostility to the nanny state that nevertheless goes alongside a refusal to accept the consequences of sidelining the government in global capitalism. A sign, perhaps, that at the level of the political unconsciousness, it is impossible to accept that there are no overall controllers. The closest thing we have to ruling powers now are nebulous, unaccountable interests. Although people are interpolated now as consumers, they still cannot help but to think of themselves as if they were citizens. Right? We know that there is a center possible, and not only is it possible, but we also know that it is necessary, right? We know that there is regulation necessary. Outside of the most fucking rabid ideologues, I don't think anyone is like, yeah, unfettered capitalism is the complete answer, because we see in our day-to-day how fucked up that is. The problem is that the system treats us as if there is no center, you know? Like, we cannot help but look for a center, and we know the center is not there. That was just really speaking to me. Because I think there is a hopeful aspect at the end of this book, and I think that it lies in the fact that people know things are bad, you know? It's just that there is an alternative. It's just not what people see. People don't see it. I don't want to get into the spectacle of things with just sight, but like, do the damn thing, people.
On 29.
Yes.
He says, neoliberals were more Leninists than the Leninists, using think tanks as the intellectual vanguard to create the ideological climate in which capitalist realism could flourish. And I thought that was great, funny, and I think a really good example of the way everything people tell you to fear about communism is just them describing capitalism. Yeah. And I don't know, it just really spoke to me. Yeah. I thought it was great. And it also reminded me of the so-called free thinkers that you...
I'm just thinking now about the Leninist model, right? It's like when he says that the neoliberals are more Leninist than Leninist, he's talking about the faith. He's talking about centralization, right? No matter what people are thinking, ultimately, they're kowtowing the line at the end of the day. Even though we know that not everyone can be a Bill Gates, it's still the ethos of, if I work hard, I can be a Bill Gates, right? Even though all that capital took flight in the 70s. You know what I mean? That's the Leninism in actually existing capitalism, is that unwavering faith towards the top. The difference is that in our pipe dream Leninist model, that top is like, I don't want to say like a benevolent dictator, but it's like a person with ideals. In this, it's literally the market. You know?
Well, that's what spoke to me about it was this idea of the, quote, so-called free thinkers, and people in the West having an attitude against Leninism because they don't like the idea of a vanguard telling them what to do, so to speak, or some sort of top-down thing where they're being made to think or say certain things, while not acknowledging that the vanguard exists in the United States. They're just fucking think tanks and lobby groups that change the conversation of the cultural zeitgeist. How many of your attitudes and opinions are formed by what the news cycle has fed you and the way that they tell you that you should think about it? Are you really that concerned about trans athletes in the United States? Because how many of them are there? Do you actually know the answer?
There's less than 4,000.
That's the whole fucking point. We let ourselves be led by this vanguard
There's literally,
while claiming to be free thinkers.
Yeah.
That aren't being led by a vanguard.
That's
it's
a paradigm shift for me, dude.
Vanguard.
The capitalist vanguard, man. I didn't even consider that because it is, man. It so fucking is, you know?
So there's that.
Well, I think it also leads into when he talks about the fact that there is a compatibility between choice and domination. He says, Frankfurt School intellectuals, and before them Plato, theorized an open compatibility between individual choice and political domination, and depicted democratic subjects who are available to political tyranny or authoritarianism precisely because they are absorbed in a province of choice and need satisfaction that they mistake for freedom. People don't know what they want. I don't know. I'm thinking about fucking Plato now. I'm thinking about the Republic, you know, the idea of like, what does Plato say would be the ideal leaders?
Philosopher kings is what he calls them. Yeah.
Is that it? Yeah. Right now I'm struggling with my own liberalism, right? I want people to be able to do what they want, right? But people don't know what they want. They should want what I want. How do we make them want what I want without being dominative? I don't think you can. However, there is compatibility between choice and domination. You know, in the Leninist model, we're choosing to subject ourselves to what should be a democratic leader at the top. We are making the choice to then have ourselves be dominated by somebody. Mm-hmm. Okay. In this case, however, in the capitalist case, that choice doesn't exist because there's no choice in your mind, right? The domination is there because of this vanguard, right? The capitalist class, but you don't make that choice. The difference between the ideologies in this case are the control of the people, right? The power going to the workers, which I know is like the baseline for what we're talking about when it comes to communism. But I mean, that's literally the difference. It's how do we empower the people? I don't know. It just spoke to me for a second there. And then I started thinking about philosopher kings because I was just thinking the last time I ran into that idea, like the perfect republic with these like intelligentsia in power, basically, that they're trained from birth to lead this country. That notion seems ridiculous because it seems illiberal. But here we are advocating essentially the same thing where the vanguard, the learned intelligentsia, takes power and then leads the people. The only difference here is that we are assuming that the people will choose us, the vanguard. Where in capitalism, the assumption is that the choice doesn't need to be made. The choice is already made.
When you say in capitalism, the choice is already made, meaning like the choice is made for you,
yes,
and then you are fed the spectacle to make you believe that you participated in the choice and or benefit from the choice?
Not even that, but just that there is no other option, right?
Okay.
We even recognize that this is a bad choice, but it's just that the alternative is worse, right? Because
this is bringing up the election discourse all over again.
Yeah. Oh, God. Please. I don't know if I can. No, the choice is already made. It's pre-configured. Right? There is a better choice. There is a better vanguard. It requires that the people choose it, though. I don't know. I'm losing the message here.
When you were talking about Plato, something you said reminded me of this other quote that brought up Sartre to me. So I had started moving in that direction with my thinking, and it's kind of contrary to what you're saying.
Okay.
I think this is on 35.
Yeah.
And this apparently comes from some guy named Marazi, but he says, post-Fordist workers are like the Old Testament Jews after they left the house of slavery, liberated from a bondage to which they have no wish to return, but also abandoned, stranded in the desert, confused about the way forward. That very much spoke to me thinking about Sartre's idea of being abandoned to freedom. And I think it speaks a lot to this kind of anxiety around the alternatives to capitalism. Like, we know that we want to find liberation. We know that we want to be exorcised from bondage. But in doing so, without any sort of clear understanding of what that alternative looks like or how we can avoid the pitfalls of just regressing back into those same forms of bondage, we're confused and kind of stranded in the desert.
I'm shaking my head because it's the devil you know. That's the problem, right? We're comfortable choosing this because we think we can fight it. You know, that's the thing is like there is a struggle inherent to capitalism, but it's one that we've already accepted. And it's the struggle for survival. And we say that capitalism is the best tool to do that, even though there's like all these contradictory things that tell us that that's not the case.
I have two more.
Go ahead.
On 56, this is just a banger quote. The world we experience is a solipsistic delusion projected from the interior of our mind, consoles rather than disturbs us, since it conforms with our infantile fantasies of omnipotence. That's just a fucking banger quote, man.
Yeah.
I don't think I read this one earlier, but it goes back to that rudderlessness point that I'm really fucking fixated on for some reason. But on the bottom of 56, he says, in these conditions of ontological precarity, forgetting becomes an adaptive strategy. So again, not to place blame on anyone, any individual, you're doing the reasonable thing to respond to the stimulus appropriately, adapting to it appropriately. But it just really spoke to me there, which kind of leads me to my last one.
Okay.
If I can do one last one.
By all means.
On 76, he's talking about the BBC of his youth and how he used to watch things like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and how television used to have kind of a more experimental bent, or at least there was a space for that kind of experimentation. And this kind of comes back to the Overton window thing that was mentioned before. He name drops Tarkovsky, which Stalker, if you haven't watched it, absolute banger.
Stalker 2 just came out yesterday.
Dope. But the line, there are a couple here. He says, such innovations are unthinkable now that the public has been displaced by the consumer. The effects that predominate in late capitalism are fear and cynicism, and they breed conformity and the cult of minimal variation.
Yeah.
There's a homogeneity to capitalism. And I was thinking about this a lot. Like, I recently watched some of the behind the scenes footage from Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. Fucking love that movie. That movie had over 2 years of pre-production. That's unthinkable today. No film will ever get that amount of space to find its way and make itself known. The difference between The Lord of the Rings and The Avengers is vast.
Yeah.
And the reason what people call the Marvelization of, well, they talk about it with video games, they talk about it with film, and it's because Marvel has, as a film studio, pioneered is the wrong word, that gives them too much credit, but has like championed this process of filmmaking, which is largely by committee, and it gets decided later in the edit, which means which is why they have all of the problems with visual effects artists being overworked and exploited, and why they get criticized for their effects not looking as good as they could, because there's crunch. I also talk about this with folks. The United States of my youth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a well-traveled person by any stretch, but like my family used to take road trips.
Yeah.
And cities used to have an identity. And now it's just like, where is the McDonald's?
We talked about it. Do you remember when I moved up here? I said I really thought Dayton was going to be different, but it feels just like Atlanta.
It's just another post-industrial city that has a McDonald's on every corner. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, there's a homogeneity. There's like a oneness that comes probably naturally from a place of comfort. We accept it because it feels comfortable, because it's known. Right. It is not another thing adding to our anxieties that are perpetuated by living in the fucking hellscape that we live in, even though this perpetuates that hellscape to some degree. I don't know. There's just really something about that really spoke to me, about the breeding of conformity, the cult of minimal variation.
Yeah. It's not innovation, right? There's no challenge, you know? Just endless permutations of the same old thing, right? Yeah. What does it say? Speaking the language of the dead through the mask of history. That's the Kurt Cobain quote, right? Let me actually pull that one up, because that was a fucking banger. Here we go. It's on page 9. The impasse that paralyzed Cobain is precisely the one that Jameson described. Like postmodern culture in general, Cobain found himself in, quote, a world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible, where all that is left is to imitate dead styles, to speak through the mask and with the voices of the styles in the imaginary museum. Here, even success meant failure. No innovation. There's nothing that challenges the norm. The norm has won, essentially.
Yeah. Above that, when he says alternative and independent don't designate something outside mainstream culture, they are styles, in fact, the dominant styles within the mainstream.
Yeah.
That definitely speaks to that. It's a form of recuperation, to come back to DeBow. I also wrote Hot Topic next to it, because when my teen years, I was very adamantly against the corporatization of punk culture. Yeah. And I fucking hated it.
But that happened like right away, you know, like even before you, man. Sorry.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Like,
I mean, what is it? The Sex Pistols, right? Where they're just
a boy
like,
band.
Yeah, you know.
Fuck the Sex Pistols.
There you go. I mean, that's not my wheelhouse, but
yeah,
I just know a little bit about that. But I think that even like, I mean, hip hop is an amazing example, right? Hip hop is by far the current music genre. You know, it's the mainstream.
Oh yeah, by far.
You know, but the thing is, it's like it's still defined as like outside. You know, but have you watched any of the FD Signifier videos on the history of hip hop?
Mm-hmm.
I think those are really fucking good. Mostly just because he talks about this exact thing, right? Hip hop was something that was like a form of artistic expression and then was immediately co-opted.
Yeah.
You know, and the whole thing about the gatekeepers and people trying to prevent the commodification or even entrench the commodification of hip hop and things is just so telling, the way that like African American people make up 13% of the population of this country, man. It's insane that what we think of as black music is like the mainstream music, you know? It doesn't make sense outside of the fact that it's that same thing, right? The alternative has become the dominant style.
I said last one, but just a banger line on 11. This apparently comes from some guy named Mike Davis who was talking about James Ellroy, but he said, this was talking about his form of noir, but he said, there is no light left to cast shadows. And oh my God, that's a beautiful fucking line.
I'm looking at page 52 at the bottom. He's talking about the new light self-assessment system or whatever. And he says, the result is a kind of postmodern capitalist version of Maoist confessionalism, in which workers are required to engage in constant symbolic self-denigration. At one point, when our line manager was extolling the virtues of the new light inspection system, he told us that the problem with our department logbooks was that they were not sufficiently self-critical. But don't worry, he urged, any self-criticisms we make are purely symbolic and will never be acted upon, as if performing self-flagellation as part of the purely formal exercise in cynical bureaucratic compliance were any less demoralizing.
Yeah.
I just think of our Monday meetings, man. Every fucking Monday.
Yeah.
You know? What's going on? What are the problems? What are the issues? The same problems every time. The same issues every time. But what happened? Nothing. You know?
Yeah.
It just really spoke to me there.
Yeah, I feel you. Okay, that was Capitalist Realism Is There No Alternative by Mark Fisher.
Was this book worth reading?
Absolutely.
100%.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I think despite our inability to come up with a coherent synthesis of its messages, it's really powerful, and I think clearly, plainly spoken.
Yes.
This is the sort of book that I will likely get multiple copies of and hand out to folks. I think it will probably be added to my short list of recommendations alongside Black Shirts and Reds and the Jakarta Method as good intros to communism, so to speak.
Yes. It's fresh, modern, fresh, new. Run, don't walk, today. No, it's really good. It's really good. And also, yeah, like I said earlier, the synthesis of everything we were trying to put together is only 80 pages long. So if you didn't read it, I cannot recommend it enough, obviously. You can find it online. I will warn you that your local library may have a copy of this audiobook like mine did. However, it is read by none other than Russell Brand. So if you don't mind listening to a man talk like this for 3 hours, then you can go for that. But given his most recent rightward re-evangelism turn, don't do that. I'm almost certain there is another version of this audiobook available, but just read the damn book.
Yeah, highly recommended.
What other questions did this leave you with?
Well, I would say that the reason this was put on my radar in the first place is because I was the subject to whom this title is directed. Is there no alternative? Because I feel that way very often. And I don't think it's very concrete in its response to that question. So but my question is like, how do we find a way out of this system that doesn't, to some degree, just end up rehashing the same tools of this system as a means of doing that?
Yeah.
I would like to find our way out of this cycle.
Yeah, I agree. The question is still how in my mind, even though in our last episode when you were talking about how we're never going to find the how, only the why, that did stick with me. You know, we didn't really talk about, I mean, we kind of breezed past his prescriptions for the left, but I think that they are important. I think that he makes very similar to prescriptions to what Debo said in his book.
Yeah.
The difference is that he's not French. So this is infinitely more readable. I don't feel like I'm being spoken down to. And I think that we've got other questions to get to, but I think maybe we should end with just the ending quote of this book, you know, because it's fucking, I mean, genuinely one of the most hopeful things I've read in a long time. So just to very briefly, he says that a new left could begin by building on desires which neoliberalism has generated, but which it's been unable to satisfy. We could argue about a massive reduction in bureaucracy. The problem is the old model, I mean, the old models, if we're talking about the Leninist model, will not necessarily do that, you know? So how can we create the new and avoid the problems of the old is my question in half of these episodes, and it's my question on this one too.
Maybe another kind of question, and this maybe feels a little superficial, but part of what I think is the appeal of this is that not only is it a modern work, but it's written like a modern work. And this sounds derogatory, but I don't mean it in that way. It's written very much like contemporary YouTube video essays are written.
Yeah.
In that it's like an analysis of popular culture through a particular lens.
Yes.
And I think that that's very accessible. And so I wonder, as you mentioned, he kind of gives prescriptions for what he thinks are like effective antagonisms to like capture the discontent of the people and move them toward new thinking, a new system. I wonder, just generally speaking, if this kind of esoteric conversation about like, well, you have to abide by the mass line, the vanguard is not going to, you know, using all this sort of jargony sort of shit isn't immediately like cutting us off at our feet and stopping us from making any movement toward like building a mass movement of the people, because like we're talking over the people, like talking about Children of Men, talking about fucking Wall-E.
Yeah.
Is that the way to like speak to the people?
We're going to YouTube essay our way to revolution.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like I'm talking down on the people as though they're unable to like grasp the concepts of Lenin or whatever. I don't mean it like that. Everyone should read State and Revolution. But what I'm saying is like, is the way to get mass appeal to like, to literally appeal to the masses. Like the masses know the Avengers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, why aren't we talking about that?
No, I think that that's a valid point. It's the same thing as before. How can you remain flexible enough to generate a mass base and still inflexible enough to create systemic change? Yeah, the problem that any opposition to flexibility risks being self-defeating. Calls for inflexibility and centralization are, to say the least, not very likely to be galvanizing.
Yeah.
You know, that's the thing. And
it's not a sexy answer.
Yeah, it's not a sexy answer.
Yeah.
I just think that it's like not black or white, shades of gray. You know, the answer is somewhere between the minimum and the maximum program, you might even say.
Fucking trot.
What we're defining here is the boundaries, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really it. The answer is within these boundaries somewhere. We're simply eliminating the most extremes, the furthest extremes, I should say. What are we reading next, Aaron?
Next, we're going to read Mutual Aid by Peter Kropotkin.
Yes, A Factor of Evolution, I believe is the subtitle.
Yeah, I loved it when I got most of the way through it the first time, so we'll see how it goes.
I've never read it. I'm excited. It's about nature, so we'll see. Talks about the birds and the bees.
Something
Not like that,
the
though.
ants.
Yeah. Hey, listener, shoot us a fucking email, man. The inbox is empty. Left unread feedback at gmail.com.
Yes, if you were one of the loyal 15 to 20 listeners of this show, with every episode, typically on the first day, we get a strong 15 people. And then over the coming, 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how lazy I am before the next episode comes out, it maybe doubles. But if you are one of the loyal 15, let us know.
Yeah.
Why do you keep coming back?
No. Don't. This is too defeatist.
No, I don't mean it in that way. I mean, like, literally, what is it about the show that keeps you coming back? What do you enjoy about the show? What should we be doing differently?
Yes, if you're one of the initial 1,500, we're a popular podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
You're, what do they call it? Manifesting it?
That's right. We want to hear from you is the thing. If you have read anything that you think we should read, let us know.
Yeah, one other suggestion for feedback would be I recently put together an anarchist reading list, and I'm curious what you think should be on that list.
We need anarchist reading. We need leftcom reading. We need Eurocom reading. We need councilcom reading. We need revcom readings. I don't know. I'm out of comms. We need readings, y'all. Let us know.
Yeah. Please do. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Don't think that we are so set in our ways that we won't read it, because we will. I promise you that.
Yeah, I think our reading list up until this point probably presents a version of us that is not accurate.
Yes, we're open. Please, you can give us some suggestions. This is mangled. Let us know. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Hit us up.
Exactly.
Yeah. I do want to end on this quote, though. Just to leave us off here, I just want to read the final paragraph in this book because I think it keeps that revolutionary optimism. The long dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of an alternative political and economic possibilities can have disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. That's all, folks.
Don't get left unread. Bye.
See ya.